I suspect that you are not going to believe me, but I cannot concern myself with that now. I must put these thoughts down before they dissolve into the mist before my eyes. But I must not write. No, I cannot commit these experiences to the written page. What I now know of the written page, the lingering lost tome buried in ancient libraries and hidden bookshops, what I now know of my own experience with legends contained in musty leaves is enough to prevent me from enjoining this nightscape onto another. No, I will not write this story, and I must be careful not to speak too loudly either. I know what the people are going to say. They're going to say that I have went off the deep end, or that I have become unhinged. I would have agreed a few years ago, but I have learned something that has shaken me. The deep end is where everything is. There is nothing in the shallow end. The shallow end is where children play with balls and laugh and tickle each other. But I do not want to be tickled. I am recording my thoughts because I can no longer trust the words I read, nor any words. Words are dangerous, for it is with the use of words that our minds are brainwashed and manipulated by those who write these words. Our brain was never designed to understand the written word. In truth, the power of understanding comes through the auditory nervous system, and the development of the written word is a function of the voice, not the mind. During the Middle Ages, when the art of book writing was perfected, the understanding of words came literally from the reader pronouncing the words being read, for the brain could not associate the function apart from the auditory nervous system. It is said that Saint Jerome could read without speaking, and the scribes were stupefied by his strange ability. But now it is common practice, but no less unnatural. Now the written word can be used as a weapon to imprint ideas directly into the consciousness of the mind without filters that come from speaking the words into consciousness. When we hear voices inside of our head, these voices are not our own. Though we mistakenly assume that they are, these voices are apart from us, separate from us. Some people think that this voice is the voice of God, and that they are the manifestation of our soul. But this is not true. Beware the voice inside your head, for it has been planted there. Just as in music, the composer speaks through a complex system of mathematical interconnections with the purpose of producing a particular effect. When the listener hears this music, he or she is not aware of the mathematical architecture, only the visceral effect produced by this magician. Do not trust words. Do not trust music. And do not trust your own mind, for it does not belong to you. All before me is a desolate landscape of mountains and lochs. But I know better. This is the least desolate place on earth. This place is teeming with life. The hills are dark, but not because of desolation. The hills are dark because of life. I have just returned from my first full day in Scotland, and my mind has been opened wide. Actually, my mind has been blown wide open. I did not speak to my brother Dan before leaving because I did not want to answer his questions. And I knew there would be an array of questions. I needed to be alone, with no itinerary, with no expectations, and without having to justify my actions. For at this time I was beginning to trust my subconscious mind, and I was beginning to follow it. I knew that this was a ridiculous thing for me to do, because in truth, I was terrified to travel alone, and I had no confidence with my rational mind, but somehow was not afraid of my subconscious mind. Ironically, my wife had no problem with it at all. She encouraged it from the beginning. Now, in truth, she did not know the complete reason that I was going. Edinburgh is a very large city, and she just assumed that I was going to finish my exploration of the medieval city. A city of impressive monuments and statues and crooked, meandering, cobbled streets. At the time, I did not understand all the logistics involved with such a trip. I was familiar with the English pound, but I was not comfortable. For most of my trips were trips with the family, trips within the continental USA, and I was happy to let my wife make these plans so that I could be free to absorb the ambience and allow my mind to wander carelessly, all the while pondering strange books and theories. The very definition of naivety, to be truthful. The biggest difficulty for me to face was my own faulty memory. I could not remember the city good enough for me to find the bookseller, the actual reason for my trip that I was trying to find. We chanced upon it the first time by accident while wandering the old city. I decided to book a room at a hotel near the castle and then work from there. It was now 2 a.m. and though I had fallen asleep on a plane for an hour or two, I was exhausted as well as anxious, for I had no idea where the hell I was. My room had a good view of the castle, and when I opened the curtains, I was surprised to see that the streets were filled with pedestrians, couples walking together, men wandering alone through the sleeping city as if 2 a.m. were no different than 2 p.m. The castle was directly across from where I stood, watching with a smile. Built upon a huge stone precipice, it towered over the city as a sign of power and omnipresence. Torches lit up the battlements, though it must have looked for hundreds and hundreds of years. I sat on the bed and looked at the castle for a long time, but my exhaustion was now gone, and I was restless again. For such is my curse to bear such terrible restlessness. Finally, I went into my suitcase and took out the cigars I brought with me. Then I went out and walked the streets, smoking and admiring the architecture of a city that had been built before the first paving stone was placed in America. The night air was brisk. After walking for an hour or so, I was ready for bed. I went back to my hotel and looked up once more to the castle, and I thought that King Sigmas must also have walked the ancient streets of Castletown on nights when he could not sleep. The next day, this morning actually, after a breakfast of eggs and ham and black pudding, I left the hotel and started walking down the Royal Mile, forming the main thoroughfare through the old city of Edinburgh. The cobbled streets and towering buildings form a wall within which pedestrians scurry and scatter throughout a fabric of shops and pubs and restaurants connected by narrow lanes and passages between the buildings called closes. I wandered the narrow streets for the uneasiness of knowing that millions of tons of stone and brick closed me in from all sides and reached high up above me, and knowing that these buildings were older than my country. Gardens and parks break against the coldness of the medieval atmosphere and bring in freshness and the sound of birds. Within a few hours, I walked into an old bookseller shop near George Street after emerging from a dark and narrow close, confident that I had found what I was looking for. As soon as I entered the shop, I remembered, for it was unchanged. More like a library than a shop, it was lined with rows of bookcases, each of which devoted to a different subject. A small set of furniture was situated around a stone fireplace, but no fire burned this day. I went to the proprietor, who was busy writing something down inside a ledger at the cash register. He was tall, middle-aged, with thinning hair and thick spectacles. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking up briefly. I told him that I was looking for information about a previous owner, a man who had sold out to become a shepherd in the Highlands. "I do not give out information about that particular gentleman," he answered politely. I was very disappointed, having come so far only to be turned away. He must have noticed the disappointment in my face. "Are you from the area?" he asked. "I am from the United States," I replied. "Of America?" "Yes," I answered. "What do you want with this gentleman? He has been away for years." Briefly, I told him about the book he had given me when I left his shop, and that I wanted to speak with him about the book. "You have traveled a long way to ask about a book. What is the name of this book?" he asked. "The Book of Sorren," I replied casually. "The Book of Sorren?" he repeated as he scrutinized me closely. "Wait a moment," he said, before walking away and going into a small office. He returned a few moments later and handed me an envelope. "This is for you," he said. "Thank you," I replied as I took the envelope from his hand, and then I left the shop and walked down to the first close that would take me to the Queen Street Gardens, constructed from an old lock for the pleasure of wealthy citizens to enjoy. I found an empty bench, sat down, and then opened a letter. It read, "Dear Sir," or should I instead call you K? "Yes, I do know about you and your endeavors. You must have already guessed by now that this book is not a book to be possessed, but is more properly a book of which one is possessed. I do admit that I did expect to hear from you before now. My compliments to you. The fact that you are here reading this letter is proof to me that my assessment of you was correct. I have waited many years for the opportunity to unburden myself of this rare and toxic heirloom. But you entered my shop that afternoon. Do you remember the fine drizzle in the air? I knew that you were the one to receive this book. I remember everything that you said on that afternoon, for I was listening, and I have memorized your words. But I had to be sure. Your presence confirms my assessment of you. When you are ready, you are to return to the shop and speak to the man who gave you this letter. He is an associate of mine, and he can be trusted. I have already procured the service of a motor car to bring you to my cottage, because you would never find it on your own. Tell the man that you are ready, and then he will take the necessary actions. Do not discuss this book. Do not even think about this book. Your questions will be answered when we meet. Travel well, and be careful with your words. For reasons of my own, I prefer that you do not know my true name. The book is authentic. By now you know this to be true. You are a younger man, and I trust that you have the energy to pursue this project. I remain at your service. Sincerely, M. I immediately read the letter again, and then a third time. And then an awful feeling began to form in my mind. I had given the book to my brother Dan, and I knew even then that I should not have let it out of my sight. Perhaps I was overreacting, but the feeling continued to haunt me. I walked through the city in a daze until I was lost. But by now I was confused, tired, hungry, and unable to think straight. When I found my hotel again, I went into the restaurant and ate a light meal and drank several pints of strong beer before going back to my room. I thought about texting my brother, but I didn't know what to say. I took out a pad of paper I had brought with me and started to write. After a few moments, I knew that I could not coordinate my thoughts in this way. So instead, I took out my phone and recorded this entry. My first full day in Scotland.